A big part of how you get good at something is to simply stop making mistakes, especially before they become a habit. So I'm going to share with you 8 super common mistakes that audio engineers make every day in the studio. The first mistake is spending more time in mixing than in tracking. And this used to be me big time. I could record a 5-song EP in a day or two because I would just set up the mics quickly, plug in the instruments, and let them play it through. And sure, if they screwed up something in the performance, we would do another take or two, but basically, whatever they brought in and however they could play it through is what we got. Of course, that meant the tones were not very good and the performances were really not good. And so I'd get to mix time and just be banging my head against the wall trying to make this thing sound pro. And what I didn't realize for a while is that that was completely impossible because the raw tracks I was working with were about 5% as good as those pro recordings. And once I figured this out, I started spending twice as much time tracking than mixing. So for that 5-song EP example, instead of spending 2 days tracking and 10 days mixing, it totally flipped to where I'm spending 10 days tracking and maybe 5 days mixing. Seriously. Second mistake is not setting up the instruments first. Now, this is partly why I was able to record so quickly before. I wasn't changing drum heads or tuning the drums or intonating guitars. It was just plug and play. Now, looking back, this seems so obvious, right? Of course, putting a bunch of mics on a terrible, untuned drum kit with old heads isn't gonna sound pro. But this is how many engineers operate. If all you're gonna do is set up mics and pilot the DAW, you're always gonna get mediocre results. But if you wanna start making great sounding records, you need to start learning the instruments themselves. How to replace drum heads, how to tune the drums, replace guitar and bass strings, and set up intonation. Most band members are completely clueless about this stuff, and so it's up to you to make sure you get the best possible starting point when you're recording. And that's why I teach engineers all of this instrument setup inside of my production training. The third mistake is compromising on performances. Now, this is another reason why I take way longer to track now than I did before. I am a stickler for getting the right performance. The main difference is that I don't let the artist decide whether a take is good enough. You cannot compromise and allow a poor performance to stay just because the drummer or guitarist thinks, nah, it's fine. No compromises. If you think it needs to be done again, you need to do it again. Now, I know most people are going to ignore this advice because it's hard, but I'll say it here anyways. 80% of your mix quality is determined by the quality of your raw tones and especially the performances that you capture. The tightness and tuning of your raw tracks is going to do way more for the punch, clarity, impact, and energy of your mixes than any EQ or compressor ever will, period. So no more compromises. All right, moving away from tracking and setup, the fourth mistake is having too many open loops. So an open loop is when you start something, but you don't finish it before you move on and do something else. And engineers do this all the time when they don't commit to sounds. It's way too common to see engineers record 3 or 4 mics on something or record 2 different guitar amps, even though they're planning to reamp it all later. You know, for some people, their project is constantly in this half-finished state. This is mentally stressful and it prevents you from building any momentum as you're producing. Now, I love the special energy that's created when you commit to sounds, and it's that process of committing to a sound and then building the next sound on top of that that makes a record sound unique. But you can't have that if everything you're recording is just a maybe that you're gonna revisit later. So start making more decisions in the moment now and stop delaying everything until later. Mistake number 5 is blurring the production and mixing phase. Now, this is especially common for people who are recording their own music. They're practically mixing as they're recording and constantly jumping back and forth, and just like the open loops, this ruins your momentum. Your brain has to operate differently when you're performing than when you're editing or mixing, and it's a bad idea to try and live in all of these places at once because you're gonna stay surface level on all of them instead of going deep on one thing at a time and then moving on. It's much more productive to clearly separate each stage: writing, recording, editing, mixing. Stay in each part of the process until you complete it. It's gonna help you stay in the zone and be much more creative, plus save you a ton of time and frustration. Mistake number 6 is overprocessing. Just doing too much EQ, compression, effects, you name it, just not knowing when to leave it alone. And this is something we can all be guilty of. You know, I certainly went through a phase of overdoing everything for about a year, and I think this is almost inevitable if you're really passionate about this craft, because you'll spend so much time researching and watching videos and filling your mind with all of these possibilities and techniques and knowledge. And then when you finally start to understand it and get a little bit better at this, then it's really easy to fall in the trap of finding any excuse to take those techniques and knowledge in your head and use them even if the situation doesn't really call for it. But I also think that overprocessing can come from making a lot of the earlier mistakes, like having bad source tones and bad performances and not committing to sounds and making decisions. You just end up struggling more and more at mix time, and you have to try harder and harder to try and fix things in the mix, more often than not piling on a lot of plugins, especially on your mix bus. And overprocessed mixes usually sound harsh, unclear, pumpy, and often overly loud and fatiguing. And a really easy way to tell if something is overprocessed is if something about the way the mix sounds is preventing you or distracting you from just enjoying the song. On the flip side though, probably just as common as overprocessing is underprocessing, which is mistake number 7. Sometimes you just don't push things far enough. And it's kind of ironic because it's often the fear of overprocessing which will lead you to underprocess. So it's a little bit of a mental game that you have to overcome. The key is to not get too much in your head with these preconceived ideas of this has to sound natural, or I shouldn't use so much drum samples, or I shouldn't be EQing this much. You know, oftentimes you might be making the right moves, but just not pushing it far enough. Check out this example. Here's what a mix sounds like with underprocessed drums. Now, those drums might sound kind of smooth and nice enough in solo, but they're not big enough. And this does not sound like a larger than life, exciting professional production. Here's what they should sound like. So in between overprocessing and underprocessing is the sweet spot. And when you can get to the place where you're not afraid to push something as much as you need to, but never going too far, then you're starting to become a pro. The 8th and final mistake is relying on your eyes. And it is so hard to overcome this. You know, these days, every plugin has some sort of crazy visualizer, and we just have all of this analytical info in front of us all the time. And it's a proven fact that our sense of sight has way more influence over our decisions than any of our other senses. So chances are what you're seeing with your eyes is probably messing up your mixes a lot more than you think. It can cause you to underprocess because the moves you're making might look too extreme on the screen, or it can cause you to overprocess because something in your mix doesn't look the same as maybe a reference track that you've brought in. Just to illustrate this, you should not be pulling up an EQ and then looking at the visualizer and then deciding what move to make. You should be listening to the sound, then deciding what needs to be done, and then pulling up the EQ. Whenever I can, I turn off these types of visualizers inside plugins, and I prefer to use plugins with the simplest interface possible. The less information I see, the better I'm gonna be able to hear, or at least I'll be forcing myself to rely on my ears and not my eyes to make a decision. Now, if you've been mixing with your eyes for a while, this is gonna be a very uncomfortable habit to break. It's gonna feel really hard not to have that visual crutch. But try to stop relying on these uber visual plugins, and I promise you over time, your mixes will get better and better. And if that's what you're looking for, watch this video next, where I debunk some of the biggest myths about mixing.